Good morning, everybody. How is everybody? Good to see you. Glad that you're here. We have folks that are out, folks not doing well. Want to remember Jim Dillingham. He's doing well. Just trying to stay in for a few more days for his COVID. Also, we understand Stephanie fell. Don't know the extent of her fall. She's just trying to recover. And so remember Stephanie. Anybody else? Anything else? Miss Nancy is still recovering from her surgery. Remember her. Our usuals. Remember our usuals that are on our list. Remember them. All right. We'll turn to Esther chapter 2. We're glad that you're here. Hope you're having a good week. If you're not, we'll talk. Always ready to talk to anybody that's not having a good week. See if we can make it a good week for them. We started last week in Esther chapter 1. We gave it a time frame, middle to late 400, so really 460 in that area, BC. We talked about the uniqueness of the book from the standpoint God's not mentioned. Of course, it's not the only book of the Bible, but it is a rarity from the standpoint that it does have a woman's name as the title of the book. One of the things that probably I should have pointed out last week that I do want to point out this week, especially as we get into the second chapter. The purpose of the book of Esther is not to talk about what's moral and what's immoral. I mean, when we look at what Ahasuerus, the king, is going to do here in chapter 2, we would say, well, that's immoral, yes. Well, that's wrong, okay, yes. Well, why isn't it condemned in the book of Esther? Well, we have to understand and we have to appreciate the fact that the book itself is not intended on explaining and straightening out the immoralities that went on. The book is its purpose, and the book's reason for being is that it might explain how that God protected his children and how God's providence will protect not only his children of that day, but really all of his children even today. And so as we will see this book and we will see sort of the time frame in which it is done, we do notice the fact that it moves on at a fairly quick rate. And we don't really stop to ponder, or let me back up, I don't stop to ponder until I really do stop to think about it on purpose. And that is the amount of time that passes. I don't know about you, but when I sit down to read the Bible, I read the Bible and let's say read for 30 minutes, and then I think, well, that all happened in relatively a short period of time. Well, it may have been years, many years. And so there are several years here within the book of Esther, and when we get towards the end and we'll study the providence of God, we'll look back at it and we'll say, oh yeah, okay, I see that now. I see the providence of God. Well, that's the reason for the book. When they started putting the Bible together, so to speak, now you remember and you know, and this is not a study of the history of the Bible. I just want to give you an understanding or a reminder, because I'm sure you already know all this. But the Bible was written from the standpoint of scrolls, but it was written individually. Each book, as we have it, was an individual, if you will, scroll, and or passed on, and it was passed on together. It was not till many years later, and it was really not till after the close of say, John's vision on the Isle of Patmos in the 80-90s, that there became a convergence, what's called a convergence of the manuscripts. In other words, they begin to say, okay, let's take these things and let's put them together and let's put them all together so that we can have them all together. And there were many other writings I mean, there were not just the 66 books that we have, but there were many other writings. And somebody has asked me to have a class on this, and we'll do it in a mini series. We'll do a 3 or 4 week study of the history of the Bible. But then they began to put the Bible together, so to speak, as we have it today. Bring all the books, kind of have a convergence of the manuscripts, and figure out, which ones do we keep, and which ones do we say, okay, they're over here. They're not inspired. And they had certain tests, certain things that they went through. Well, each book was kept for reasons that were at least plain and obvious. And the book of Esther, even though kept, was highly questioned. And highly questioned because it didn't have God in it, or the name God in it. It also didn't denounce any of the immorality that went on. It just told the story. Well, when we get, like I say, we get on into this chapter, we're going to look at it and we're going to say, oh, wait a minute. He had all of these women. He brought them in. He brought them in for a night stay. He judged them, if you will, based upon a night stay. And then they seemingly, they were moved to the second harem, if you will. And we'll discuss that in a few minutes. Well, where's the condemnation of that? Well, indeed, where is it? Well, it's not in this book, but it's because of the purpose of the book. The reason for it to be written was not to condemn or if you will, even to say that it was okay. And so as we look at this story, we find out in Esther chapter 1 that Ahasuerus had thrown a big party, if you will. It lasted for several months. And one day he got to feeling good. He'd partied too much, and he got to feeling good, and he felt good about his wife, Queen Vashti, and he said, I want you to come. Basically, he wanted to parade her in front of the folks, and she said, nope, not coming. And he said, no, I want you to come. She said, nope, not coming. Not coming to that. Not doing that. And so then there arose a problem, at least the way the men of that day saw it, and that is that if the queen can do that to the king, then our wives can do it to us. What are we going to do? And so we moved on into the first 7 verses of the second chapter last week, and we looked at the fact that here they are. Here's the king caught in this dilemma. Seemingly, it seems to me, maybe I'm reading something into this that shouldn't be there, and I hope not. But and I hope I'm right. But if I'm not, it's a matter of opinion what I'm about to say. But it seems as if King Ahasuerus all of a sudden now has a dilemma, has a problem. And maybe he wants to go back on it. It seems like to me that he does. So, we're going to fix this problem. We're going to fix Vashti. But there's already a plan now, or there's a plan being put in place wherein Vashti will be removed as queen and a new queen will be chosen. And so he can't go back. And so notice that it says even in verse 4, this thing pleased the king, and he did so. In other words, here's what we're going to do. And so a plan was put in place. We look at this book, and then we look at, verses 5, 6, and 7. And we see that basically there were ladies that were chosen. And out of the ladies were they're going to be, as we're going to see, they're going to be groomed for a period of time, and then they're going to be brought to the king. And so there's going to be, and we'll see this unveiled, but we'll see basically 2 harems, and I'll give you a little background with regards to all that when we get there. But then in verses 5, 6, and 7, we see the introduction of a young lady by the name of Esther. Esther, the word Esther means star. This is her Persian name. We find out in verse 5 her Hebrew name, Adasha. We will call her Esther because it's easier to pronounce. It's more recognizable. We will come across her name a couple of times, her Hebrew name a couple of times. But one of the things, or some of the things that we find out about her, and I want to reiterate this, is found in verse 7. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, and that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. So in other words, this would have been his niece Yes. Let's see. Wait a minute. His uncle's daughter. Yeah, that would have been, no, his cousin. Excuse me. His cousin. There. I'm not good at these things. Suzanne can tell you, I'll say, how am I kin to them? She usually tells me, and I just get it that way. But Esther was without mother and without father, so she was, you might even say, adopted. The woman itself, it says, was lovely, was beautiful. Some versions read differently. The ESV reads that she had a beautiful figure and was lovely. Other versions say that she had a beautiful form and face. And so exactly what the Hebrew is saying, it's really hard to nail down. Hebrew is harder to nail down than Greek. And Hebrew sometimes is like nailing Jell-O to the wall. It's real hard to fix, to figure out. So whatever the case, we can come to the understanding that she was pretty, maybe had a nice figure, nice face. She was beautiful, pretty. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her and took her as his own daughter. So thus he adopted her. And that's where we get to today. That's where we're ready to start. Anything anybody want to say, Rad, before we move forward? All right. So it was that when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, to the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of women. Okay, so part of the agreement that we looked at last week is that women were brought from all over, and they were trained, maybe is one way of putting it. They were put in a harem, but they were given what they needed to be given to sort of get them ready for what is about to happen to them. And so Esther is found to be pleasing, and so she's brought in. And she's brought in, and notice that she's given quite a bit of favor. Verse 9 says that he readily gave beauty preparations. She was given, all the pampering that she could have. She was given special treatment, and it says beauty preparations besides her allowance, what they were already giving her. They were going to give her some more, and so extra. And then she was given maidservants, and they were from the king's palace. And he moved her to the best place in the house of women. She is pampered. He has seen already something in her that he appreciates. And so he's making sure that she's well taken care of. Esther, verse 10, had not revealed her people or her family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. She hadn't told anybody that she was a Hebrew. She hadn't told anybody that she was a Jew. And you might say, well, okay, so she's not a good candidate for example because she's being deceptive. Yeah, remember we said this is not so much a moral book as it is a book about the providence of God. But she keeps quiet, and part of the reason she keeps quiet is because her cousin Mordecai has said, don't tell anybody. Let's keep that a secret. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. There's a question that comes to mind. And the question that comes to mind is, how in the world could Mordecai be this helicopter adopted father that is there all the time, standing outside her abode or her place where she is residing and seemingly maybe pacing back and forth, but waiting to find out about Esther. He's wanting to know. You might say, well, he was a good parent. He was there. He was present, and he wanted to know. Yeah. But how was he able to be there? Why was he working? Well, no one knows, but there is a conjecture in certain scholarly circles that Mordecai was a higher ranking official, whether among the Jewish folks or not, but a higher ranking official, and he had the opportunity to have more time to do this. Well, that's conjecture. Who knows? But nevertheless, he's there and he's interested. He wants to know about Esther. He wants to know what's happening to her. Each young woman's turn, verse 12, came to go in to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months preparation, according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned: 6 months of oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. This was a contest. This is a contest. They're finding the queen. So they have the first harem, and in the first harem, you're tutored. 6 months and 6 months, 6 months in perfumes, 6 months in oils, and she's going to smell good. Which I guess that was, for lack of a better term, that was a good thing, because stop and think about it. They didn't take baths too often, if at all. So for 12 months, these ladies were taught the prim and proper way, trained in beauty and how to be beautiful. And so Esther is trained just like all the rest of them. Verse 13, thus prepared each young woman, went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the woman's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Contest. Sad by any standard, whether you say it's sad by today's standard, but just sad the way they're doing these ladies. So you go in and you go to the king and you go and spend one night. Now, here's probably what happened to them. And if you want to see a little bit of this, if you'll go to 2 Samuel chapter 20, I'm going to clue you in on something. What happened is that you would leave the first harem and you would go when you were appointed to go. You would go and you would spend the night with the king. You could carry with you what you wanted to, but you were basically spending the night to pleasure the king. Then at the end of the night, at the beginning or the next morning, you would go back, but you would go to a second harem. You wouldn't go back to the first harem where you had been wined, dined, and trained for 12 months. You would go to a second harem. According to the way, seemingly, and what we've been able to find historically, is that in the second harem you would stay. You would pretty much stay for the rest of your life. You would be given a place to stay with regards to the king. Notice 2 Samuel 20, verse 3. We get a little bit of insight in this. It says, David came to the house of Jerusalem. The king took the 10 women, his concubines, whom he left to keep the house, and put them in seclusion and supported them, but did not go to them. So they were shut up to the day of their death, living in widowhood. This is what we also believe probably happened with regards to those in Persia. That, in other words, you left the king, and if he was pleased with you, he might call for you again, but he had to call for you by name. So you had to leave some sort of calling card. If you didn't, you were still treated, you were still taken care of by the king, but you could not marry. You were kept in a harem, but you weren't called for again. And so this is, like I say, terrible by any stretch of the imagination. But nevertheless, it was what was done. Anything anybody like to say or add? So verse 15. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. It seems as if, now maybe not so, but the way this is being told, it seems as if Esther may have received special favor at every turn. For the 12 months, she got a great place, good, a lot of folks around her, everything she needed. Here, all of a sudden, she has everything she needs. And not only that, but Haggai begins to tell her, here's what you need to take with you. He would have well known. He would have probably well known the king and what his likes were and what he would prefer. Now you could, if you wanted to, you could give a star to Esther here because Esther evidently listened to his advice. She was one willing to listen to what she was told. And so Esther listens and she's willing to do. And so Esther, it says, obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. Great beauty, probably a good personality. And so she goes in. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is in the month of 10th, in the 7th reign of his year. Now we're down to somewhere around what would be December or January of our years, but with regards to the year 479, 478 BC. And so it says the king loved Esther more than all the other women. She became his favorite. And she obtained grace and favor in his sight, more than all the virgins. So that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants. And he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. There's basically three things that he did. When he takes her to be queen, when he takes Esther to be queen. And like I say, this is a terrible way of doing things, but yet we're going to see the providence of God, how God works all of this story out for the good of his people, for the saving of his people. Esther finds favor. She becomes his favorite, verse 17. And notice that it says she obtained grace and favor in his sight. His chosen. And so he made her queen. Vashti lost her title because, according to chapter 1, which had happened before or a long time before, years before, he says, you're no longer queen. And so now he makes Esther queen. Three things. Look at verse 18. He made a great feast, called it the Feast of Esther, for all the officials and servants. He proclaimed a holiday. Now, a holiday from what? A holiday from taxes, a holiday of rest, a holiday from work, a holiday from maybe the remission of taxes. We don't know. Just he proclaimed a holiday, and he gave gifts. So he not only proclaimed a holiday, but seemingly folks got something for the generosity of the king. Anything else? When the virgins were gathered together, in verse 19, a second time, that's that second harem, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the commands of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. Mordecai is still outside the palace. He's still wanting to know all the time what's going on with Esther, what's going on with Esther, what's going on with Esther. Well, she's been made queen. And Mordecai loves her. Esther is playing the dutiful role. Even to Mordecai, she's still not revealing. She's queen, but she's still not revealing her background. Now, we could sit there and say, well, surely Ahasuerus knew. Surely if Mordecai was someone well thought of, folks knew his background. knew he was a Jew and would have assumed that if he was a Jew, then family would have been Jew, whether they understood that Esther was an adopted daughter or just a cousin. Well, those are assumptions that might safely be made, but we can't make them and say that they're a surety. It would appear as if, at least at this point as we're reading the story, that this is a secret that has been kept. And no one knows, or no one is the wiser, or if they are, they're not acting upon it. And so in those days, verse 21, while Mordecai sat with the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on gallows. And it was written in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. Let's look at this. This is a plot to kill the king. This was common. This was common. In days of kings, folks get mad, upset, get riled up. Let's kill the king. And so let's do away with the king. And so here's the plot to kill the king. Here's two folks. Notice that they're two of the king's eunuchs. These are two of the king's servants. Maybe they were mad. They were tired of being servants. Maybe they were mad at the king because he had done something. Who knows? The scriptures don't tell us. And from a historical standpoint, I wasn't able to find anything that gave a rational reason. But whatever the case may be, they would come up with a plot. But Mordecai, in being in and out amongst the people, finds out. Most people tip off their secrets. Years and years ago, before you go to a car lot now, and I like it better this way now. I like to go on a car lot, and I like them to tell me how much they'll take for it, and I can either give that or I can not, and I can walk off. I like that. I don't like dickering. I'm not good at it, and I don't like it. And so if you want to bring something to me and say, I'll take $50 for it, and you'll really take $25, just tell me you take $25. I might tip you, I might not. But at the same time, too, I'd rather deal with you that way. And of course, you'll say, well, but I'll take 50. Well, yeah, I understand that. But I'm not one of those that likes to barter or dicker. That's just not my cup of tea. But I read many years ago in Reader's Digest that in the days of dickering, if you will, on a car lot, this article said, and it just made good sense to me. I was young. I was 25 years old probably when I read this. This is for Ethan, so I was, like I say, 25, 26. The article said that go on a car lot and say very little. Let the salesman talk. In their tendency to talk, they'll keep talking. They'll either tell you more about the car than you would have learned otherwise, or they'll keep coming down on the price. Suzanne and I bought one brand new car. Everything else that we've bought in our married life has been used. And in buying the new car, it was quite interesting. They came down 3 or 4 times on the price before we ever left. They even, and we went to a car lot in McKenzie, Tennessee, was where we bought this. And this was a car dealership at that time in a very small community that was selling 150 cars a month. And so the guy that owned it, will not mention Gary Simmons' name because he's long since passed, but Gary was a big deal. And so the salesman said, hey, I'll bring in Gary Simmons. I said, if he can't bring the price down, you don't have to bring him in. And he stuck his head in the door and he came off a little bit. So they came off of it 3 or 4 times. But anyway, I'm telling the story. The next week, salesman called me, hey, have you bought a car? Well, no, not yet. Well, I'm going to come down another X amount of dollars. Okay. Called me another time. I'm going to come down another X amount of dollars. Okay. So finally, they still had the car, and they said, he called me, and the guy said, I'm coming down $25, and Paul, I just want you to know this is the last time I'm calling you, and this is the last time I'm coming down. Okay, we'll be there tomorrow. We'll buy the car. Now, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But that took a period of a little over a month. And like I say, I'd have to go back and really think about the story. But they came off price about 5 or 6 times all told before I bought the car. This is kind of this story here at this point reminds me, some folks just can't keep quiet. And so Mordecai finds out that these guys are making a plot to kill the king. And so Mordecai goes and tells Esther, and Esther goes and tells as a messenger of Mordecai. So this is going to get Mordecai and Esther in good with the king. And so they go out, and notice what it says. They go out to catch the guys. They made inquiry of it. It's confirmed. And it says that they hanged, they hanged on the gallows. We think of a hanging. The Hebrew word is kind of ambivalent, and it might not necessarily be a hanging as we would think of a hanging, because to hang on gallows also in biblical times, it was the idea of impaling somebody, having maybe a fixed stake and impaling, throwing somebody on the stake and leaving them and letting them hang there to die. Either way, I don't care if it's a hanging or if it's an impaling. Terrible death. Terrible. But now remember who we're dealing with. Persians. And you go back and you study the history of the Persians. They were some of the meanest people ever walked the face of the earth. And so it says that these folks, their story ends, if you will, in a very quick fashion. But you might say, well, why is this included? Well, it gives us some insight into the fact that the king, Ahasuerus, really loved the beauty of Esther. But now all of a sudden, she's really on my side. And so she's finding favor with the king. And that's part of why I believe this little paragraph is in this story. Anything else? Okay. Well, let's move on to chapter 3. We're moving forward now. Notice what it says. Verse 3, how it begins. After these things. Well, what about these things? How long after? Best we can put together, as we'll see from some clues here in a minute, but the best we can put together, the jump from chapter 2 to chapter 3 is about 5 years. Don't hold it to the day, the birthday, but give or take, a little over 4 to 5 years, almost 5 years later. So we're talking about 474 BC, 473, somewhere in that neighborhood. When we compare what verse 7 says to what we found in verse 16 of the 2nd chapter, we figure out the time frame. So about 5 years later, King Ahasuerus promotes Haman. Maybe sometime within that time frame, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. And I had missed this or forgotten it in my studies and was reminded of it this week as I was studying, that being the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, that there's a thought in some scholarly circles that suggests that Haman was kin to Agag, the king, back in 1 Samuel, a distant relative of them. And if that be the case, the Amalekites, if you remember, back in 1 Samuel, the Amalekites and the Jews were enemies. This may have been, and this is a theory, so don't hold it as gospel. This may have been why some were not upset with the idea of Haman. Why do I keep saying Haman? Mordecai and his adopted daughter were possibly not Jews, because it was thought that they were kin to Agag and thus Amalekites. But I want you to think about that theory for a second. I want you to think about it from this standpoint. Oh, well, scholars said it, it must be true. No. Scholars have a tendency to try to fill in the blanks. You see, they're trying to answer the question, why doesn't anyone realize Esther's a Jew? Well, we don't know. But it is kind of interesting in giving this background that there's a possibility that this is true. The other thought that when it talks about the Agite, that Agite could have been a district, an area, like we think of a state, but a district within the Persian Empire. And so we really don't know. That's the answer. We really don't know. It just gives us a little background as far as who Haman was. But Haman is promoted, and he advanced him and set his seat above all the princes. Excuse me, I got the story mixed up, didn't I? Yes, I'm sorry, I did. We're talking about Haman now, not Mordecai. My brain's working faster than my mouth's working. And so Haman, who's Haman? Well, Haman is, don't get him confused. He's not Mordecai, like I did just now. Haman is going to be hung on his own gallows in a minute. But Haman is a man that is moving up in the world. And they set him, notice what they do, they set him above all the princes. He's elevated who were with him. And all the king's servants who were with the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. So Haman is possibly the kin to Agag. I'm sorry, I don't know. I knew better than that. I knew when I was saying it, something didn't sound right. Why didn't y'all stop me? But when Haman is advanced and promoted, it seems through the text here that he's getting the big head. Haman has moved up within the king's ranks during the time frame, and maybe 5 years later, like we said, from chapter 2. And Haman has everybody answering to him. He's probably one of those that had enough associates around him that if he said do this, they did it. Go over here and do that, they did it. And the people were bowing down to him. It says that those that were within the king's gates bowed down, paid homage to him, verse 2. And so he was really feeling good about himself. But Mordecai, Esther's adopted father, remember? Not bowing down. Now, once again, we're left speculation. We don't know why. Why does Mordecai not bow down to Haman? Don't know. Could it have been that Mordecai, being Jew, knew that you were not to bow down to anybody but God? Could be. Could it be that Mordecai was an individual that didn't feel as receptive about Haman as the other folks did? Could have been. We're left to speculate, don't we? But Haman is going to get upset. So the king's servants, verse 3, who are within the king's gate, said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's commands? Why do you do this? It's almost as if they're trying to get to the bottom of it. They're trying to figure out, they're trying to find out. Now remember, and it's believed, but we don't know for sure. Go back to chapter 2, that Mordecai is still coming around on a daily basis trying to find out about Esther. Some have thought that Mordecai is still coming around, and the people realize that Mordecai is not paying Haman the homage that everybody else is. So why aren't you doing this? And notice how they put it. Why do you transgress the king's command? This was something that evidently then was not just the choice of the people, it was the command of the king. You honor my boy Haman. You treat him well. Well, it happened in verse 4 that when they spoke to him daily, he would not listen to them. That they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. They're trying to change. They're trying to see what Mordecai is going to do. While they've been trying to change Mordecai, as they watch him, they then give a report to Haman. Hey, look, not everybody likes you. Well, one of the things that any leader would tell Mordecai is that no leader is 100% accepted, right? The old adage, third like you, a third don't like you, and a third don't care. It so rings true. It so rings true. But nevertheless, they say, hey, Haman, your boy Mordecai out here, he's kin to the queen. He's not bowing down. He's not doing what the king wanted done. He is in violation. And so, Haman, verse 5, saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage. Haman was filled with wrath. Maybe it was his pride. Maybe it was his arrogance. Maybe it was the fact that, why do I have someone that seemingly is disloyal, that is important in the scheme of things, whatever. But it says, but he disdained or he despised to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. The people of Mordecai. What does that mean? Don't know. Does it mean that Mordecai had folks? Well, this is why we have somewhat assumed, as we did earlier on in our discussion, that Mordecai must have had some sort of position. Now it talks about the people of Mordecai. Could it have just been Jewish folks? Yeah, it could have been. We don't know. There's not enough given here. But instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So it is becoming known that Mordecai is Jew. And so the plot begins. Let's talk about Haman for a minute. Was Haman a sociopath? Could have been. Was he egomaniac? Could have been. He's a guy that's probably fed on his own power and on his own influence. He's gotten a head of steam. He seems to be a big man. He's the big man on campus, if you will. He's growing in power and prestige. And he wants everybody to bow down. The king has made the decree. And he is upset. And so, news now is finally reaching the front that, Mordecai is Jew. How much the people are tying together Esther with Mordecai now, right now, as we're telling the story, we don't see it. But all of a sudden, it's all coming out. Mordecai, who, like we said, must have been some kind of leader, maybe among the Jewish people, that Mordecai is being found out. And so they said, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. If you write in your Bible, underline that verse. If you don't write, make a mental note. This is key right here. As we continue our study, but this is a key verse in our study of the book of Esther, because it's going to tell us of the plan, and the plan that's coming. We know, we've read the story. Haman comes up with this idea. He's going to get rid of the Jews. But it's at this point, and this is the reason that this part of the story is told. So now we have an understanding that The Persians, of course, did not like the Jews, but it is an understanding of what's fixing to happen. But I want you to think about, and I want you to concentrate, as we've run out of time, I want you to concentrate on the fact that Haman has an issue, if you will. He has an issue, a personal issue, with regards to what he thinks of himself. He has an issue with regards to what's he going to do with Mordecai. But he also has a place and a position. And so he's able to influence those that he needs to influence. Is there anything else? Well, next time I get off on talking about the wrong person, just raise your hand and say, hey, get back on subject. Yeah, this is all going to make sense in a few minutes. This is a great story. It's all going to make sense. It's all going to work out. Yes, I would too. I wonder if she was not, and I don't know because I don't know historically either, but I wonder if she wasn't, so to speak, as those put in the second harem where they were basically treated as widows taken care of, but she couldn't have been appreciated. And so some have speculated, and I do know this, some have speculated not so much what happened to her, but that she was a lady that was trying to do what they believed to be right, and she was held in low esteem amongst those that she came in contact with because they were all favorites of the king, but yet the king really didn't want to do anything to her. That's a theory. That's all it is. So, anything else? Well, all right, let's bow for a word of prayer right quick. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, thankful for the blessing of it, thankful for the opportunity to study your word. We ask that you be with those that we talked about earlier in class that are unable to be out. Bless them and keep them. Give them all a speedy recovery. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. What a great story. We'll continue it next week.